The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, and help me welcome Bill O'Brien, last Speaker of the House in 2010.
Yeah.
We'd like to have you back again, too. But
well, you're nice to have me back here. I don't think they're going to let me back there, but you're a pretty nice guy to let me come back, Carl.
Well, I hear about something you've written that you're going to tell us a little bit about.
Oh, I did, yeah. No, I wrote an article yesterday, which was published yesterday, actually, in the New Hampshire Journal. And you know, Carl, one of the things that has confounded me, and I think it confounds a lot of us, is that, you know, you encounter this rhetoric, you know, from the left, and you'll be saying to yourself, that's just not true. and it's really obvious to everyone it's not true. You know, you hear people on the left say a biological man can be a woman just by declaration.
Right,
and, you know, that's not true. and then you hear things like, polar bears are going to stink, and then you look it up and say, no, there's more 5 times the amount of polar bears now, today, than there was 70 years ago. They're not going to extinct. And you hear them say even serious things, you know, sad things like the most important aspect of a person is their race and not their character. And you know, that's just not true. And that's a particular example. Bad things can happen if people start believing this. And so you think to yourself, because there's good people who absolutely believe they're true. You know, they're conscious individuals, they're intelligent, you meet them in business, and they're real smart and everything. And you say to yourself, well, why do you think that's true? And it occurred to me, based on a book that I read some years back, why they think this. And it was a really kind of a touching book. It was written by an author called Joan Didion. And she wrote about the death of her husband and literary collaborators, John Gregory Dunn, both good writers. Her husband suddenly died. And she talked about how the first year after his death, she couldn't not just not accept it, she couldn't even know of his death. Her grief was so intense that she would, encounter his shoes and I gotta get rid. I can. He's going to be back. He'll need these shoes. And she would make a meal, for example, a dinner, and set the table for both of them, and then sit at the table, getting irritated, inconvenienced because he's late. He won't come out of the office. And it really. Her grief was too intense to accept it. Eventually, she had to, and that's I think what we encounter on the left. Their politics are so important. There'd be such misery if the bankruptcy of their politics and their ideology were accepted due to the facts. That they have to accept things that are unreal.
It's a world they make.
Yeah, it's a world they construct. Sometimes it's conscious. They'll say, if you, and I've understood this about the left, if you describe the reality that you want, then it'll become the reality that is. Now, that's not true. The polar bears are doing okay. Men aren't going to become women, but it's a conscious belief.
No, but it's going back to the what do you say, communist technique of you repeat it long enough, people would believe it?
Well, and then there's some, and that's a point I make in the article. That certainly is the big lie, and I think there's some who are just cynical and saying, well, we'll, be disruptive in society, we'll break things down so we can have more control. I've come across, we all have relatives and friends, and you sit there going, well, that's mind-boggling that you'd believe that. And yet they do. They absolutely do believe it.
Well, this morning I hear now they're trying to push this big migration from the South on climate control.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a stretch.
See, this is the usefulness to them of these fictions, this fantasy. If they don't like what somebody's saying, they can say you're racist.
Right.
If they want to promote a policy that is economically stupid or demographically destructive, immigration, open borders, they would say, oh, it's climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen it in so many absurd ways. We all know the reality is that President Trump and his administration had taken the border crisis under Obama and in 4 years had brought it under control. Partly by building a wall, but also partly by going to these other countries and saying, you have an interest in controlling your population from assaulting our border. And as a consequence, 2020 was the best year we'd had really in many, many years in terms of attempts to cross the border and illegal migration. Joe Biden and his administration just blew it open. So now we have the most illegal, in the past 3 or 4 months, it's been the most illegal immigration in I believe it is 20 years. And how do they explain it? Well, it's Donald Trump's fault.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. It is so absurd.
Well, it's terrible because just of the way they did it. Even if they really believe that some things had to change, you don't have to have the radical change because you're paying the penalty. We close a pipeline, gas goes up $1 a gallon.
Sure.
We stop building the wall, we get people coming in, and these aren't friendly people.
Right.
A lot of places.
No, and people will say that we're a nation of immigrants. How can you deny immigrants? Yeah. There was a great deal of difference between the immigration that took place up until the last several decades in the immigration that is the historical reality of America. The immigration before wasn't to a welfare state. You came here and you made it, or you went home. And I read somewhere that about a third of the immigrants went home. And either because they couldn't make it or eventually they wanted to. That was a real difference. Also, unlike what critical race theory would tell you, which is the opposite of this, because this is their fantasy, the best people came to America. The people who had the get up and go came to America. The people who had dreams came to America. Now we have people who are coming in, some of them obviously the legal immigrants and so forth, but those people aren't increasing the strength of our population as immigration did in the past. Rather, they're people who are looking for the free handouts of a welfare state. And they're not vetted, they just come across the border. And it weakens our country, and it denies the sovereignty of our country.
I think people ought to go back a little bit in history and see how they handled it with Ellis Island in New York. How most people came over there and went through a system, and they're even recorded there. If you want to see some history, go back there and see how we assimilated those people.
When empires, countries, nations have decided not to police their borders, when they have lost their sense of sovereignty, that is when they fall. We talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. If you looked at what was happening in the 400 AD, that century there, it wasn't much worse than the assaults on the Roman Empire from the borders and tribes than it had been in prior centuries. The difference is that Rome had lost its spirit, its sense of uniqueness, its sense that it had the right to define its borders and protect its borders. It had its right to tell those outside the borders, you can't come in unless we say you can. And the example of that was, I think it was the Huns, or it was the Visigoths, arrived at the Danube River. And in prior times, if you pushed an army up against the Roman Empire border, they'd send a legion there and push you back. And in this instance, however, the government was weak. The people were dispirited. They didn't think there was anything unique in being Roman. And so when the horde pushed up, they went and saw them and said, well, the Huns are behind us. Somebody else is behind us. Can we just let us go through? And, we're just trying to protect ourselves. We're just going through. We won't stay. And they said, sure, yeah, I guess. Sounds reasonable enough. And they came in and sacked Rome, attacked Rome itself and sacked it. And 40 years later, the whole thing fell apart.
Yeah.
And so, protecting borders is very, very important.
And the way people are teaching our kids, I think, is affecting it now. I mean, we're seeing people who have graduated from 10 or 20 years of some of this socialistic approach.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And
so some of the most eloquent voices against this critical race theory, against America losing its sense of exceptionalism, are those who grew up under communist countries. Now, I know you know some who grew up when the Russian Empire, known generally as the Soviet Union, was still in power. I met a woman yesterday who speaks at a conservative meeting that I run with, twice a month, and she grew up in communist China.
Yeah.
And the words they use are somewhat different, but the sentiment is the same, which is, we've seen this happen. This woman is saying, I've seen the Cultural Revolution. It was our critical race theory. And we have other people say, I grew up in the Ukraine. We have seen this type of socialism and dispiritedness and among the population. Don't let it happen here. I tried to get out of here. When I was working with Ted Cruz on his run for the presidency, I had a chance to meet his dad, his father. His father's a minister. And he grew up in Cuba. And eventually had to leave. He was involved in the rebellion against the dictatorship when he was young, which was the Batista dictatorship. And it became fairly evident that he was going to lose his life unless he left. And he came to America. And when I was talking to him, he said, as young people, and really the whole population of Cuba, always knew that if things were bad, or always knew, as an example of the way things should be, there was America. Look to America. And as he said to me, and it's frightening to think of it, there's no next America.
Yeah.
We have to preserve liberty here. It's no longer, my ancestors living in Ireland and saying, these darn British are pretty oppressive. Let's go to America. Life can be better, and we can get jobs and all. There's no next America.
You don't see any country where people are going to, immigrating to, other than us.
No.
And I think that's telling in a way.
Well, it is very telling. It really is. My daughter, when she was going to UNH, spent a summer in what was the new, we'd been about 10 years, I guess, maybe a little bit more since the Soviet Union fell apart, but she was assisting, it was, because she was assisting in this project to change the old communist youth worker camps in rural areas into traditional American style summer camp, where you would, rather than learn how to, defeat the great imperialist monsters, learn scrimshaw or something. Just typical American, learn how to swim. She was saying that all the young people there, all of them who she was working with, their dream was to come to America. And I understand it, but we want the best from other countries, and we want, I think immigrants are great, but we want the best.
Yeah, we want people who want to contribute to
and want to work. We want, it doesn't bother me that people come here with PhDs and all that. Those are going to add to our country. It does bother me that people come here who are uneducated, don't take the time to learn our language, and basically expect to, and then in the end do live on welfare.
Well, one thing I'm seeing, Bill, I don't know, you made mention of your meeting the other day. We had the Republican Club of Nashua's meeting last night, and one of the gals from the Chinese American group.
Yes.
They're ones that are looking. They saw what happened not too many years ago. Either their parents or their grandparents were affected by the revolution in China, and how they see what's happening now.
Yes.
And you can't just accept what's happening over there. I don't know if we should go to war for it, but we should at least make sure everybody else knows what's happening there.
Well, we should at least not be useful idiots.
Right.
You know, what Lenin called the business people who would, you know, in the phrase being used, sell me the rope that I'm going to use to hang them. And we have a lot of useful idiots here. I mean, we look at these now, quote, woke corporations that will parrot the leftist line. We have, you know, Delta Airlines. We have Coca-Cola, who we have their CEOs out of complete ignorance say that the voter integrity law passed by Georgia is racist. We have the president out of complete ignorance stand up and say it's racist, even though it enacted more open voting laws than his own state of Delaware.
Right.
It allows a longer voting. It allows more mail-in voting. This is there's a term that I don't know if your viewers have heard it. It's used quite a bit among people in politics. It's called gaslighting. And I didn't know what it was at first, and so looked it up. And what gaslighting came from, that term, it came from I think it was a Broadway play, in which the theme was that this man was trying to drive his wife crazy. And it was made a long time, it played a long time ago. And so in those days they had gas lights. And every night when he'd come home, he would turn down the gas feed just a bit. And so his wife would say, "Oh, honey, doesn't it seem to get kind of dark in here?" He goes, "Oh, no, no, not at all. It's, it's very bright. I would think it's too bright." And this was his effort to try to drive his wife crazy. And this is gaslighting. This is basically Joe Biden and the Democrats gaslighting the nation by telling them to ignore reality. Right. It is their fantasy in order to create crisis and create an environment where their radical policies can be put into place.
And a lot of people are afraid of some of those things. They just don't want to resist some of the things that are obvious to us.
Yeah, and look at the cancel culture. You have that fellow, what's his name? Hank Azzaro, I think his name was. I probably have his name slightly wrong. He played the voice he for years and years and years on the Simpson cartoon show of the Indian character, the Asian Indian character. And, he'd use an Indian accent and all. He turned out, if you watch the show, he was one of the more intelligent players. They're all kind of ridiculous. It's a comedy cartoon. And he, a few days back, apologized. I think his phrase was, to everyone of Indian descent for having caused them distress, no doubt, by portraying this cartoon.
Emotional, yeah. Play on your emotion.
Yeah. John Cleese, the actor from Monty Python, had a good response to that, because he immediately, and he's not a conservative guy at all. His politics is pretty liberal, but he immediately tweeted out his own apology. He said, "I want to apologize to all white people of English descent for having spent years and years making fun of them. Any distress I've caused, I certainly regret it and ask their forgiveness." It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. We need more of that. We need, when they call out people and they say, apologize, when they call out people and say, you're racist, when they call out people and say that you're misogynist, and we know we're not, and we're not acting that way, we ought to just say to them, forget it.
Yeah.
Forget it. I don't
Right.
care what you think.
Right.
They're a minority.
Right.
You know, you look at the polls on voting rights. 70% of the people, or more, in polls across the spectrum, say people ought to have a voter ID. You ought to show up with a voter ID, and yet we have this leftist president trying to gaslight us.
Right.
To
Yeah.
think how somehow that's racist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm a little bit encouraged because I see some people getting back, trying to change the wave, if you will. Some of these ethnic groups are doing that. They see that and they're getting together. The Latins or the blacks are getting stronger and stronger on the more conservative side.
Well, I think so. I mean, because if there are any victims of leftist ideology, it are those groups, and particularly African Americans, who are disparaged by the Democrat identity politics. They're basically being told you have no agency, you can't take care of yourself, give your vote to us because we will take care of you. You know, this is outrageous. Carl, I don't want anyone to take care of me and my family. We'll take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
We work hard, and that's the same with you.
Right.
And dignity comes through the ability to have as much control over your life as possible.
That's right.
And you cede the control, and that's what these people want, is for
Control.
folks to feel so disabled that all they can do is just vote for those who, in fact, are disabling them.
Of course, they feel that they know better, and they make you feel like that's true. And it's just the opposite.
It is the opposite. And we see things done to folks in today's society that are just outrageous. You know, Ronald Reagan used to say that a government that can do anything for you can do anything to you.
Right.
And we have to recognize, as we see, what a lot of African Americans are justifiably concerned about, which is harsh policing tactics and so forth, as a government that is too large.
Right. Well, I'd like to just bring up something I brought along because I just felt we were going to talk about something about this. And these are three different areas. Here's the verdict, which is the Judicial Watch, who does a lot of exposure of some of these situations. And they talk about it. So anybody who wants to get that can just go and get into the Judicial Watch, and they'll send you this copy. But it's amazing how many things are going on behind the scene in our government, and they're the ones that are uncovering it.
Oh, look at the latest example. We have this young woman. I know she's young, a woman police officer. Where was it? Out in a suburb of Minneapolis, who shot somebody at a traffic stop, and she was very careless. We've seen the video. We know what happened. She was just whatever, stressed out, grabbed a gun, thought it was something else, and shot somebody. And so she's properly facing criminal charges, and yet the Capitol police officer who shot through a closed door into an unarmed crowd of individuals and killed one person. Let us not forget her name, Ashley Babbitt, I think.
Right.
And
right in the face.
Right in the face. And they won't even tell us his name, her name. And they've reached a decision announced yesterday that they're not going to indict them. We've come to the point where there's two systems of justice in this country. There's the system for conservatives, which is most of us, and there's the system for the elite, the Democrat left.
Well, that whole thing of the January 6th thing in the Senate, where they said 5 people were killed in it. Now, what happens? The medical examiner says 2 died of natural causes. One was killed, yes, by an officer. Another one, I forget what happened to him. But the other guy that they said was hit with a fire extinguisher or something like that, they had no evidence of him being hit by it. In fact, they have not made a decision on what killed him yet.
Gaslighting. It's gaslighting. It's just
Right.
making it up. And if you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, they think people will believe it. And look at the consequences of these myths that they put over and repeat again and again and again. We have our nation's capital building, our sacred nation capital building, looking like it's East Berlin,
Right.
Germany, surrounded by barbed wire, walls there. Look at the inauguration we had. This is somebody who's been elected by a popular vote that they couldn't allow the people in to see him being inaugurated. That's banana republic stuff. They ought to be ashamed of themselves.
Well, that's why I brought these things along, because they're incorporating and making more of these things. The National Right to Life is another group. We got the unions are getting too strong. They don't listen to their own people, and the people put up with it.
Right.
Just because they seem to be getting more money, but they don't really get all the money because they have to pay it to the unions who waste it. And there's how many criminal acts. And National Right to Life brings those out that are going on within the unions, where they're taking care of money, that not only the fees, but sometimes getting it to the pension funds.
Sure. The unions had a role in American history when capitalism was much harsher. We didn't have the laws protecting workers. We didn't have the more advanced employment laws. Now they're just a negative. It's not at all surprising that the organizing attempt, the big one across the nation was the organizing attempt that they focused in on a huge warehouse of Amazon in, I believe it was Alabama. They were going to get it organized and all. And the workers voted it down. And so what are they trying to do now? They're trying to have what they call card check voting.
Yeah.
So if you need my vote, you come to my house as a union guy at 10 o'clock at night. And if you encounter somebody like me, a little 5'6" guy, and you send over a big union organizer that's 6'4" and say, here, why don't you sign this card? They're going to get a lot of cards signed. That's their way of conducting.
That's right. And some of that's legal. I mean, that is something that was way back in when the unions were fighting to be allowed at all. But that shouldn't be a legal thing now. They cannot do force.
That legislation's in front of the Congress under the Democrats and the Biden administration.
Right.
We're going to have a lot of work to do in 2 years and 4 years.
That's right. And here's another example, again, is Hillsdale College. You know them.
Sure.
Here's a college that refuses any kind of federal aid. They don't want any aid because that is the thing that controls education. If you get federal aid, you got to do what they say.
Right.
And this brings out the history. And this one is, this is another free thing for the people to go imprint this. It's a flyer that comes out with history, science, politics, and COVID. Will truth prevail? They have some very good articles in that. And that's what we should be doing.
We have to search for information, and we have to also assume the reality that the mainstream media is gaslighting us.
Well, we'd like to get the audience involved in that. I think what we want you to come to our next meeting of the Republican Club of Nashua, and it is on the second Wednesday of May, and we'll be looking for new members. We want to participate in local elections this year in a strong way, and we need some people to work with us to change some of the directions of what's happening here in the city, what's giving us higher taxes, what's giving us too much of problems that we shouldn't have, whether it's in education or operation of just the regular things the city does. So welcome, and we'll be at the Marriott Hotel. Thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.